Uh, I am recording the lectures so that I can put them online. I've gotten almost all of them uploaded, but I discovered I had a problem this morning. Somehow I switched to slow-mo on my phone with one of them, and so it was recorded in like 240 frames per second and is a 48 gigabyte file. And I can speed it up so that it's at normal speed. That's okay. But YouTube doesn't want my 48 gigabyte file, and so I've got to go and reduce the resolution somehow before I can try to upload it to YouTube. But I've got all of them except that one, and then the one I'm currently recording for the day uploaded and a playlist created. So once I get that last file fixed, then I'll start putting them. I'll make a link to the Google Classroom so that you can find them and catch up on anything that you've missed and use them for studying. So today we are talking about parables. And parables are a fairly big deal for thinking about Jesus and the teachings of the New Testament because Jesus uses them so frequently. But Jesus is not the first to use a parable. They're actually a fairly common way of teaching, and we've had parables in some form for about as long as we've had recorded history, about as long as we've had any teachings recorded. For example, Plato records Socrates using parables as a way of teaching some of his philosophical ideas. And for the most part, we tend to learn through parables or a parable-like thing for a lot of stuff we learn. The word parable comes from this Greek word, which if you don't know the Greek alphabet, you don't actually have to have that. This is the English transliteration, parabolos, which meant comparison or illustration. And it was a practical thing, or it could either be a physical object or a story that was used to illustrate a difficult to grasp idea or an abstract concept. And so that was the original Greek meaning, the Greek understanding. We can think of it as using a story with elements of our common experience or something that is common knowledge to us to teach unfamiliar ideas. It is a way of teaching by analogy, which again is a way that we learn most of what we learn that's unfamiliar to us. Is anybody in like physics or interested in like quantum physics, quantum mechanics? I am really a weird person, aren't I? Teach scripture and love quantum physics. Those don't come together very often. Anyway, there's a whole lot of parables and a whole lot of analogies for learning quantum physics because the concepts that we're trying to get a grasp on are so foreign to us that if you don't have some kind of analogy, it's really hard to imagine what's going on. So basically, the math works and it predicts things really well. So we believe that it's true, but trying to understand it is really strange to us. But there's all kinds of things. Practically any subject, when you're learning something new, especially once you can reach adulthood, nearly everything that you learn by analogy is something that you already know. It's something that's already familiar to you. You make a connection and you learn much more quickly that way. And so this, for this kind of thing, a parable is not an unfamiliar or uncommon way of teaching, but Jesus uses them to a crazy degree more than most teachers, and he has very interesting things to say about why he uses them, which we'll get to momentarily. You may have heard parables referred to in church as the parables of Jesus as being an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, or some similar phrasing, and that's a helpful kind of pithy way of saying it. It's a story that is based in something that we are familiar with, something that is either part of our common experience or common knowledge, and that is then used to teach something that is unfamiliar or uncommon. So earthly story with heavenly means kind of a shorthand as long as you know what you mean when you say that. And so parables themselves, this is what a parable is. It's a teaching by analogy. It is taking something that you have experienced or taking something that is in the common experience or common knowledge of your hearers and using that to illustrate something that is difficult for them, that is not their common experience. So there's, that's what it is, and I use them frequently on Sunday mornings when I'm preaching. I'll use illustrations. That's what we usually call them in a sermon instead of a parable. It's an illustration. And so I'll take some story from common American experience or something that I know is common to my congregation, which means farm analogies very frequently. And I'll use that story to illustrate a scriptural point, something that Scripture is saying, so that it's more alive and real to people. But Jesus does some interesting stuff and talks about parables as being something a little different. In Matthew chapter 13, his disciples specifically ask him in Matthew 13, verse 10, the disciples come to him after he has given one of the first parable examples in the New Testament, the parable of the sower, which we're going to get back to later. He tells this parable, and then his disciples come to him and ask, why do you teach the people in parables? Why don't you speak more plainly to them? Why do you always teach in these parables? And Jesus' response in verses 11 through 17 is a little strange, a little unexpected. I'm going to read part of that. I'm going to read through 11 through 13 because it carries the main meaning, and then he elaborates on it with the rest of that. But Jesus replies to their question, why do you teach in parables? He says, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. So, pretty clear now, right? That's why Jesus teaches in parables. If you got it from me reading that, you're doing great. Just saying. But what Jesus is basically saying is that he uses parables intentionally to conceal what he's saying, at least in part. So that some people will understand it and some won't, and that those who do will have to work for it. And then he talks about those who have getting more and those who do not have having what they have taken away. And we'll get to that, what he means by that in a moment. But Jesus says that he uses the form of parables to both conceal and reveal what he's trying to say. And some of his practical reasons for this are that, one, he is saying some stuff that is very radical for his time. He is saying some things that are very radical to the people that he would be speaking to. And some of them, especially the religious leaders of his day, would very quickly take what he's saying and use it against him and reject him for it and start more trouble for him. It would bring the religious conflict that does eventually brew and come, and we're going to talk about that more, I think, in the next section, next time we're good. That religious conflict that was already brewing would build up and reach its head so much faster if he had just said plainly everything that he intended to say from the beginning. And so he says it in parables partly to kind of disguise some of what he's saying until people have had more time to reflect on it and ruminate on it and figure out what it means. And then later they'll come back at it and be mad at it for what he's saying. So partly it's to conceal what he's saying from those that would strike out at him or that would go to war with him over it and bring about the crucifixion even earlier than intended. He wants that build-up time to be able to teach his disciples and to spend more time teaching the public and performing miracles and doing the things that he does. He wants more time to do the ministry, so he speaks in parables, at least in part, to confuse and to drag out how long it takes for the opposition to build up. But then also he uses parables because on one hand they're a little bit harder to understand, so it takes longer for people to get it and understand what he's saying and come against him. But also because they affect people much more deeply, and so once you get it, you've got it in a much more profound way. And I'm going to show you very practically with a couple of these how that works, what it does. But he often, part of the reason for using parables is because stories in general, and parables are all stories, stories in general engage you on a much deeper level and in a much deeper way than just facts. I can relate to you some factual information, but if I can relate it to you, or if I can get you engaged in a story to learn it, you'll absorb it much more deeply. Because stories, parables in this case particularly, engage you on the emotional level and the volitional level with your convictions, the decisions that you make, and on the level of identity, your understanding of who you are and what your place in the world is. Stories engage you on all those levels, whereas just relating to facts may only hit you in the head. That may just be an intellectual exercise for you. And so Jesus uses parables in order to convey things. And there's stories do have this power. They do this thing in general. Like they get you, they pull you in, and you identify with something going on in the story, and it feels more real to you, that it's much more engaging. In fact, this is actually backed up by neuroscience. There have been studies done where they would attach leads, EKG, run EKGs on people while they were listening to a story or while they were watching a television show, watching something on streaming platforms, whatever, while they were absorbing or listening to, hearing, understanding a story, while they were engaging with a story, they would run these EKGs, and they found that the people that as they were absorbing the story, the different sections of their brain would light up that would correspond to what their brain would do if they were actually experiencing what the protagonist in the story was experiencing. And so if the protagonist is in an intellectual debate, the kind of reasoning part of their brain would be more engaged. If they were in conversation, then the language part of their brain would be more engaged. If they were enduring suffering, if they were in pain, then the parts of their brain that would be dealing with the experience of pain would be reacting. And so their brains would actually react as though they were experiencing what the protagonist was experiencing, what the person that they identified with in the story was experiencing. And so a story engages you and pulls you in, and you actually experience the story as though it were, at least to some degree, happening to you. And this, by the way, is this is a significant thing that you need to consider and think about when you're deciding what stories to consume and what media to consume. Because when you consume media, when you consume a story, you actually do begin to identify with a character, and your brain processes it, at least in part, as though it's happening to you. Which means that when you come out the other side of the story, you feel like you have had an experience. And so you feel like later when you're making decisions, you're making it based on your experience, what you have learned from experience. But you haven't actually learned it from your experience. You've learned it from the scripted experiences of characters who were written by somebody else. And so it can be a very subtle way to influence the decisions that people make. And so be careful with what you consume, or at least be very aware of the messages and the subtext in what you consume. Because if you're not very careful, those things will influence how you perceive reality, because you will feel the experiences of the characters in the story you engage with as though it was your experience, even though it's not. It's actually a scripted experience written by somebody else. And so that's not really related to your New Testament stuff, other than this parables. That's just an old man giving, relatively old man giving relatively younger people some advice. Watch out. So the parables are especially effective because as stories, they draw you in, they engage you on deeper levels than you could before. And because they do that, because they draw you in, they engage you on all these different levels. They engage your emotions, they engage your will and your decision making and your convictions and your sense of who you are and what the world is around you. Because they draw you in all these ways, they tend to either pull you towards or away from him, because they remove neutrality. They remove the sense that you can just stand back as an objective or unaffected observer and watch the thing and then pick between the two sides or take them both. So they tend to remove the impersonal nature of abstract thought and put you in the middle of the decision making. And then you'll find either that you are pulled toward or repulsed by what's being said, what's being presented. And we'll see that as we get into some of Jesus' parables. I'll point out very directly how that works on us, and hopefully we will see it. But it tends to draw people either toward Jesus, those that are ready to hear from him, or push people away from Jesus, those that are going to reject him because of what he's saying. And so this is where that latter part of what Jesus said about parables comes in, that I was talking about earlier, that those who have will be given an abundance, and those who do not have, even what they have will be taken away. This is what he's referring to. It's that with his teachings, they tend to push you one way or another, and there's not really a way to stand and be neutral, if you really understand what he's saying. And especially with his parables, it's impossible to stand and be neutral. You will either be drawn towards him because you're ready for it, or be pushed away because you are very much not. And so that's a lot of why Jesus does parables, why he teaches so deeply and so much in parables. Because it both conceals and reveals. It conceals what he's saying until the time when he's ready for everyone to start opposing him, when he's ready for the opposition to come. And it reveals to his disciples and to others what he means, but when they work for it. And when they work for it, it draws them deeper in, it makes them think more critically, more deeply about it. It engages their emotions and their convictions and their sense of who they are. And so it has a very dramatic impact, either pulling them towards or pushing them away. So that's why Jesus teaches in this way. Now, I want to use a few examples to show you how this works, and then kind of give you a few examples of how his parables teach, what kind of things he taught through his parables. But as with other stuff that I've said this semester, this is by no means a complete listing, and I'm giving you a sample because this is a survey course and we have today to cover the parables, when, once again, there are entire semester courses offered just on Jesus' parables, what they mean, how that works. And so this is very much just hitting the high points. But I want to start with a couple that would probably be, if I had just cold, y'all walked into the room and I said, write down the name of a parable. Probably one of these two would have been the first ones that you thought of, because these are the two best known, the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the prodigal son. Although the headings in most modern translations don't have prodigal son, they have lost son. But that's the name that it's better known by, is prodigal son. So start here with the Good Samaritan, and I will show you another of the things that is very true about the parables is that you experience them and you will understand them on multiple levels if you give them time. If you keep coming back to them over and over again, you will understand them and learn from them on multiple levels. Because they're stories, they engage you more deeply, and so there's more opportunity to learn on multiple levels. So the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable comes about because a man comes to Jesus, a teacher of the law comes to Jesus and asks, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus replies and gives him the answer, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And wishing, the man hears that, and he hears especially the love your neighbor as yourself, and he understands from that, he understands the implications from that. And the implications from that include that if I have to love my neighbor as myself, then that means I have to do for them the things that I do for myself, which includes making sure that they have food and clothing and shelter, that they have their basic needs met, and that they have more than that they have some kind of leisure and pleasure, and they have a path or an opportunity to pursue what is most important to them. And that I have to continue doing these things even if I don't like them, because I do these things for myself even when I don't like myself, even when I don't like what I've been doing. So loving your neighbor as yourself is pretty far-reaching. You have to do a whole lot of things for other people that you normally only do for yourself if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself. And so the teacher of the law, realizing the implications and wanting to justify himself and wanting to kind of put limits on how far-reaching this can go, he asked Jesus, then who is my neighbor? If we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, surely we have to limit who we call our neighbor to some degree so that we have something left over, right? So that it's not too onerous a command. And so instead of replying directly to that question and giving him a clear answer to his question, Jesus responds with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in this parable, in this story, he says, there was a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. These violent men came and took him and beat him within an inch of his life and left him by the roadside with nothing. They stripped his clothing and they took all of his valuables, everything that was worth anything, and left him by the roadside with nothing and half dead. And then they go away with their riches or with their spoils. And along that same road came a little while later a priest and a Levite separately. First the priest came, then the Levite came. And when they saw the man bleeding and dying on the side of the road, they walked to the other side of the road and went around him and kept on going on their way. They didn't stop.
I thought it was a rabbi that came along and helped on the way. Aren't rabbi and priest kind of the same thing, sort of?
Rabbi is a teacher. Priest is a priest. And in order to be a priest, you have the Levites, which is everyone descended from the tribe of Levi. And then within that tribe of Levi, there was Aaron, Moses' half-brother, and then you have to be descended from the family of Aaron specifically in order to be a priest. To be a rabbi, you can be anybody. You just have to have knowledge in the law and a following and people listening to you while you teach it. Okay. And so most of the leaders in the local synagogues were rabbis, but if you wanted a sacrifice performed, it had to be done by a priest in the temple at Jerusalem. And so that's the big difference between the priests and the rabbis. Rabbis were known as teachers, the teachers of the law. It's literally what the word means. Rabbi means teacher. So they are teachers, and the priests are those that work in the temple and offer sacrifices on behalf of the people and lead the people on God's behalf in worship.
Okay.
So that's the difference. So a priest comes by and a Levite come by, and they both pass on the other side of the road. And there's some, in the context, in the ancient, in this time, you could maybe possibly understand why they would do that. Because a priest has to be clean. A priest has to be holy in order to do their job. They can't go into the temple if they are unclean. And touching a dead body makes you unclean. And so if they go and they help this guy and he's already dead, or if he dies while they're trying to help him, then they're unclean and they can't go offer sacrifices on behalf of people. And so maybe that's in the mindset of the priests at the time. The Levites, same thing. They don't offer sacrifices, but because they are of the tribe of Levi, and that's the tribe that is dedicated in the Old Testament to the upkeep of the tabernacle and making sure that worship happens, they had other jobs like making sure that there was water in the temple, and making sure that there was wood for the fires in the temple, and making sure that everything was prepared and ready for the temple, and making sure that they had the supplies and everything that they needed for worship. And so Levites also had occupation. They had a job inside the temple. They had things they had to do in the temple. And maybe they also would have been concerned about being made unclean by touching a dead body. But either way, Jesus tells the story. Whatever the thought was, these guys go and pass by on the other side of the road. And then, a little later, a Samaritan passes through. And the Samaritan, seeing the man, stops and goes to him and loads him up, bandages him up quickly, or takes care of him on the spot, loads him up on his donkey, and takes him to the town. He has pours wine and oil on his wounds to help to disinfect them and protect them, and then brings him to town and takes care of him and in an inn, and pays for him to stay in the inn, and pays the innkeeper extra to take care of the man, and then promises the innkeeper that whatever you spend caring for him, that is, if you spend anything in excess of what I've given you, I will pay you, I'll reimburse you when I come back. But take care of this man for me. And then he goes on about his business. And then after the story is done, after he's told the story, Jesus looks at the teacher of the law and says, which of these men, which of those in the story was a neighbor to the man that fell into the hands of robbers? And the teacher obviously replies and says, the one who had mercy on him. He doesn't notice that it doesn't say the Samaritan. He says the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. So you go do that. And that's the parable. That's the story. So if I was asking you, what does this mean? What does the parable of the Good Samaritan mean? You've heard it. What meaning do you take from it?
Well, for Good Samaritan, usually means like helping someone in need.
Yeah. Helping those in need, showing mercy to those in need. Yeah. Anything else that they see?
That's really that I can think of when it comes to a Good Samaritan. Like, well, just someone generally helping someone in need.
Yeah. Well, this is how that title gets applied to somebody. Good Samaritan is somebody that helps others in need. But specifically because Jesus told this story and used a Samaritan as the hero in the story. Which we'll get back to in a moment, is why that is significant. But yeah, I mean that's kind of the typical meaning that people are going to take from it. That's what when you read it, when you understand it, the first time, that's probably what you're going to take from it. Jesus is commanding his people, or he's teaching that you should be merciful. You should show mercy to those that have need. If you find somebody that is in a desperate situation, give them help. Take care of them. And he says, this is being a neighbor. This is what it means to be a neighbor, because that's specifically the question he's answering with this story. Which one of them was a neighbor to him? The one who had mercy on him. And so show mercy to them, right? But then if you take it, you take a step back and you think a little bit more critically, you think a little bit more contextually. Remember, context is king. And what comes before and after is part of the context, but the historical setting that it was set in is also part of the context. And so if you think about the historical setting that it was set in, what have we already said about the Samaritans and how they related to the Jewish people? They were best buddies, right? No. Remember, the Samaritans were those who were descended from the northern tribes who had been carried off into captivity, and so they were no longer Jewish because they had been forced to intermarry, and so there was Jewish ancestry there, but they had been all mixed in with other stuff. And the same thing had happened with the religion. They had taken aspects of Jewish religion and were already wandering from it before they got taken into captivity, but after it got forcibly intermixed with a whole bunch of stuff from Assyria and other parts of the world. And so they practiced a religion that was partly Jewish, that had some major Jewish themes in it, including looking for the Messiah.
But as things changed too.
But had, a whole bunch of other stuff that was muddied up and mixed in with other religions and other stuff. And a whole bunch of the focus of Jewish religion was on remaining pure, remaining holy, and not touched by what is unclean. And so since that was a major focus of Jewish religion, having somebody next door that practices a form of your religion that is all mixed in and muddied up with other stuff didn't make them popular. And so there was a kind of a mix of religious prejudice and racism going on between the people of Israel and the people of Samaria, the Jewish people and the Samaritans. And so the Samaritans were not loved at all. They were not liked at all. As we talked about, Jesus was unusual because he passed through Samaria to get to and from Judea, when most Jewish people would actually take the long way around, cross over the Jordan River, go along the outside, and then come back across and add days to their journey in order to avoid going through Samaria, lest the dust of the place somehow make them unclean. And so in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus has the Samaritan man do the healing. Take care of it. And from that, you might add on to the merciful, be merciful, that you should be merciful even to your enemies, or even to those that hate you, or even to those that you hate, whichever way you want to think that through. But you ought to show that same mercy. You ought to do to others as you would have them do to you, and you should show mercy to those that are in need, regardless of your past relationship with them, regardless of whether you are friends or enemies. And that's what it means to be a neighbor. To be a neighbor is to take care of the person who is near you or who has needs, regardless of the background, regardless of the quality of your relationship. But that would still that would be a little bit deeper level, right? That'd be thinking it through a little bit harder. But then there's another level that this affects you as a story, and you probably don't notice it. This would have been especially true of those in the first century, and a little bit less now because we use Good Samaritan in such a positive way that we don't have any negative connotation with the Samaritan. But in the first century, again, they would not have been okay with Samaritan. The Jewish audience would not have been comfortable with the Samaritan. And so if you are going to identify, if you're a first century Jewish person and you are going to identify with somebody in the story, who's it going to be? Is it going to be the robbers? Hope not. If you're identifying with people that beat and kill others and steal their stuff, you've got a list of problems. And you're probably not slowing down to listen to a religious message from Jesus anyway, right? So probably not. Probably not going to identify with the robbers. What about the priests and the Levite? You would see them positively, but you have to be born into the right family to even have a potential to be a priest or a Levite.
Yeah.
And you have to, specifically to be a priest, you have to prove that you have 10 generations of your family that are from the right family line. Like, I don't even know my family past 5 generations. But they had to know and be able to prove through 10 generations that they were from the right family line in order to be a priest. And so priests and Levites were a pretty selective group, and you didn't just become one. There was no road to become a priest or a Levite if you weren't born one, if you weren't born into the right families. And so it'd be very hard in that culture to imagine yourself or to put yourself in the position of a priest or a Levite. You wouldn't be able to identify with them because you have to be born to the right family to be one. And so you couldn't be the priest or Levite. What about the Samaritan? Well, if you're a first century Jew, the Samaritans are your hated neighbors that have corrupted your religion, so probably not. Which means the only person in the story you can identify with is the man who's beaten and left for dead. Which means that you have to experience this entire story as somebody so weak and vulnerable and who is dependent on the care of somebody that you despise. That turns this whole story upside down and changes the way you experience it and prepares you to accept the kingdom of God, where you have to come as somebody weak and vulnerable needing mercy. So normally, you could tell the story in lots of other ways, but if you were lots of people would tell the story with it not being the Samaritan that does the good deed, but with somebody that would be easier to identify with, so that you would naturally put yourself in that position and could see yourself doing it and would be more likely to go and imitate.
Essentially, Good Samaritan can be received in a positive or negative way depending on who you see. how they.
Your experience coming to it. And we don't have any negative experience with Samaritans, and we hear this story, and it's called the Good Samaritan. So we have pretty good positive connotation with Samaritan.
Mm-hmm.
They would not.
Back then.
Yeah, the first century would not have had, they would not have, the audience Jesus was talking to would not have had positive connotation with the Samaritan, so they couldn't have identified with it. The only person they could have identified with was the man in the ditch.
Mm-hmm.
And so their whole experience of this parable is going to be different. And only those who were in a position of humility and being open to being vulnerable and receiving mercy could hear this story and respond well to it. Everyone else would have been pushed away by it. Everybody that was fiercely independent or could not accept receiving mercy from an enemy would have been pushed away by it, which is how this would come in, the being pulled toward or pushed away from Jesus by a will of God. And so the parable of the Good Samaritan is a great example of how this works. It works on multiple levels. You can keep coming back to it and learning from it. And then the very basic framing of it does something to you that you probably aren't even aware is happening. Right? Similar thing with the prodigal son. If y'all know the story, the prodigal son, Jesus, it's a parable that he gives. It's actually part of the context. Context is king. It's part of a series of stories about lost things. So we have a lost coin at the beginning of the chapter, and then we have a lost sheep that the shepherd goes and finds. And at the end of both of these, there's a big celebration because the person has found what they lost, and they're celebrating it with their friends. And then he tells the story of the lost son, or the prodigal son. And in this story, a wealthy man, has two sons. The elder son is relatively faithful and loyal and sticks around and does what his father tells him to. The younger son has a wild streak, wild at heart, and ends up, after some time, coming to his father and asking his father to divide the inheritance with him early, which is kind of a backhanded way of saying, I wish you were dead so I could have my money, so just go ahead and give me my money. There's a layer that most people don't pick up on to read the story, but it basically say, to me, it would be better if you were dead, so just go ahead and give me my part of the inheritance. And so, but the father does this. He gives him his part of the inheritance, and he goes off and the younger son leaves and goes off into a far country, as far away from his father as he can get. And he takes all of that money that his father gave him, all of that inheritance that he was given, and he starts to spend it lavishly, and has this really big, lavish lifestyle. And all these people gather around him to try to catch what he's given off. Friends to gather around him to live the party life with him, until things go poorly and there's a famine in that land and food prices skyrocket, and he ends up spending everything that he has trying to keep a roof over his head and food in his stomach, until finally he is so desperate that he goes and hires himself out to feed pigs to get a little bit of money to be able to keep eating. And again, remember, Jewish audience, pigs are unclean animals. This would have been an absolutely abhorrent job to them. They would not have been willing to do this under nearly any circumstance except saving their own life. And so this young man has lost everything that he received from his father. All the inheritance is gone, and now he's here in this pig pen, practically starving to death, working for a few pennies to try to buy some food, and he finds himself, he's so hungry that he looks at the pigs' food, looks at the slop that they feed the pigs, and thinks, that would be tasty right now. I don't know if y'all have ever seen what pigs are fed regularly, but if you ever find yourself thinking, that looks tasty right now, you are having a medical emergency, go to the doctor and get some food, right? This is not good. And so the younger son looks at the pig's food and thinks, man, I would like to eat some of this right now. And when he thinks that, something about that triggers him, he comes to his senses and he says, even the hands that work on my father's farm are well fed and clothed and safe. And I have messed everything up, but maybe if I go back to my father, he would at least hire me as a worker, as a hand, even though I'm not worthy to be called his son anymore.
Yeah, I looked up at the pig's food. Yeah,
you don't want that.
Yeah, I'm good.
And so he goes back, and as the young son is going back, he's rehearsing in his head the story of the apology that he's going to give. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I have gone away. I have squandered everything that you gave me. I have nothing left. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But if you will take me on as one of your hired hands, I will work for you. And so he goes back, and he's rehearsing this apology, rehearsing the things he's going to say. And when he gets in sight of the father's land, the father's house, his father is outside, and he looks up and he sees his son coming a long way off, And the text says that the father hikes up his robe and takes off and runs to greet his son. Running is not a dignified thing, especially in a robe, when you have to hike it up part of the way to be able to run. It's not a thing that a dignified, wealthy landowner of the first century would be likely to be seen doing. But this dignified, wealthy landowner takes off and runs to his son. And as the father gets close, the son begins to give his rehearsed speech. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But then the father is on him and hugging him and kissing him and thankful that he has returned and calling out to the servants, bring him a robe, bring him a good robe, and bring him shoes for his feet, and bring him rings for his fingers.
That's what I was thinking about.
And then he says, and kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a feast. And so the son never actually gets to finish his speech. He never actually gets to say, I would be happy to be your servant. If you would hire me as a hired hand, I'd be happy to work for you. Instead, before he can say any more than, I am no longer worthy to be called your son, the father is on him, kissing him, hugging him, welcoming him home, and receiving him back as his son. And so they go back to the house and they have this great feast, this great big party with the fatted calf that has been slain for the occasion. And at some point, the father goes out to talk to the older son because the older son refuses to come inside because the younger son is inside. The younger son has been welcomed home, and he is furious that the father has welcomed this younger son that has done so much back home. And so the father goes out to speak to him, and he says to him, the father says to the son, you have always, and you've always had all that I have. The older brother says something along the lines of, I have always been with you, I've always been faithful to you, I've done everything that you've asked, and you've never even given me a little goat, a young goat to go and celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours who has gone and squandered everything that you gave him and has tarnished our name comes back, and you kill the fatted calf and celebrate for him. And so the father replies and says something like, you have always been with me, and everything that I have has been yours. But it is right for us to celebrate because this brother of yours was dead and is now alive. He was lost and now he's found. And so we must celebrate. And that's where the story ends. That's where the parable ends. So if we stop in there, what are you supposed to learn from that? What's the meaning of this parable?
Even if you stray, I think like even if you stray from God, well, if you come back, like you go back, you'll still love Him.
Yeah.
From what I'm seeing it, if you stray from the path or like squander everything, you're gonna have to work for it, essentially.
Well,
he literally spent all of his inheritance and then had to work in a pig farming thing. Because, like you said earlier, that would be
abhorrent. Yeah, we discussed that.
And when he got back to his dad, he was like, his dad still loved him, and it's like.
So he found himself having to work for nearly nothing because he had squandered what he had. But then when he came home, he was received with open arms. And he came back with apology and with just some self-awareness that he had messed up and was not worthy to be called a son. And he's received with open arms and a party thrown for him. Right? So forgiveness, that it is possible to be forgiven, or that even if those who go and do something egregious, those who wander far away from what the Father intends, far away from what God intends, if they repent and come home, will be welcomed as children, because that's what parents do. Anything else that you see in the story?
I think the main theme of it is just forgiveness.
Yeah.
And acceptance. And I say
That is a big chunk of it. But then I want you to go back to the story and ask a question. Which son is actually lost?
He was paid. He must be moving.
Yeah. At the end of the story, which son is inside the house and which son is out? Which son is having the party thrown and which one is mad about it? And then do you notice what the older son asked for, what he says he wanted? Like, this son of yours has gone away and squandered everything you had and came back, and you slayed a fatted calf for him, but you never even gave me a little goat to go and party with my friends. He also wants away from the father. He's just been too scared to go. And he's mad now that his father has killed the fatted calf for his younger brother when he would never give him anything to go away and do his own thing. They both had wanted out, but the younger son got out, found how bad it was, and has come back. And the younger son still thinks that he is worthy on his own, that the father owes him something, and he still wants out.
Not knowing what's going to happen, what happened to the older brother, and then
And so, which son is the prodigal?
neither.
If it's either of them, it's the older brother. The older brother is the one that is on the outs with his father at the end of the story. He's the one that won't come into the house. He's the one that's missing out. And so part of what this story is actually intended to communicate is not just that you can be forgiven if you come back, but that if you find yourself, if you believe, you think of yourself as being righteous enough without coming to the Father, righteous enough without repenting and coming back, then you're actually finding yourself on the outside. That your good works or your righteousness will not help you. That they will actually become a hindrance to you if they are a source of pride and you think that you're good enough on your own. And that, basically, that's not just that you can be forgiven if you come to the Father in repentance, if you come back to the Father, but that if you refuse to come back to the Father because you think you have been good enough, then you find yourself outside anyway. And so there's a danger with that self-righteousness. And this also is it's also a picture of what's happening with the religious life of Israel. People are, Israel sees itself largely as being God's chosen people, as the righteous people, as the holy people. And so they think, we've always been here with you. We've always been in the family. We've always been nearby. But now they're rejecting the Son. When God sends his Son, they are rejecting him and not responding to him. And so the religious leadership is kind of like this older brother. And we'll see, there's several of his parables have some bearing on that religious conflict that's coming. The sower and the soils. This is actually kind of the first example of a parable that Jesus gives. And it's in the section where he's talking about what parables mean and what he's doing with them. And in the parable of the four soils, there's a sower that goes out to sow his seed, and he scatters the seed, and the seed falls in four different kinds of places. One is on the path, where the soil is packed down and hard for people walking on it. And because it has been packed down and hard, the birds of the air come and eat up the seed shortly after they fall, and nothing comes of it. They never get a chance to grow. And so, those seeds are gone. And then some of the seeds fall on the side of the road where some weeds are growing up. They fall into some underbrush and places where there's already plants growing. And so these seeds that fall among the weeds, they sprout up pretty quickly, but all of the worries and concerns of this life choke them out, like a weed does any other plant. These seeds get choked out by the worries and concerns of this life. So even though they spring up a little bit, they start to grow a little bit, they shortly get choked out and don't produce anything of any value. They don't grow anything. And some of the seeds fall on rocky ground, so soil that has a whole lot of rocks mixed in with it. Basically, it's soil that has not been properly prepared as a field, but it's out there. And these seeds, they spring up quickly, but because the soil is so rocky, they get no depth to their roots. And so when the sun comes up, they aren't hardy enough to handle the sun, and so they end up getting shriveled up by the sun and a dry wind and shrivel out and die. And then finally, some of the seed falls on the prepared good soil, the soil that's actually been prepared to be a field. And that seed sprouts up and grows, and its roots go deep, and it produces a crop, 10 or 30 or 100 times more than was planted. And so a little bit of seed produces a whole lot of crop.
And started growing wheat, right?
Yeah.
In the story, right?
Those wheat, yeah. We will see the next parable is wheat and weeds mixed together. That's, we'll get to that momentarily. This one is the parable of the four soils, where you have these four different soil types that all have different reactions. And then it's after this that the disciples ask, why do you teach in parables? And he gives them the answer that he gives them. And then a little later, he gives them an explanation for what these mean, what this parable means. And so he says, the sower is God, and the seed that is sown is the word. It's the word being proclaimed. And so it's the message about the kingdom of God. It's the things that Jesus is teaching and saying. And so the seed goes and it gets scattered, and it falls on different kinds of people. It falls on people with different hearts. Their hearts in different situations. Some of them have become very cynical and very jaded towards life. They have very hardened hearts, and that's like the seed that falls on the path where it's been beaten down. And very quickly, the enemy comes and snatches away what was sown, and little or nothing comes from it. And then there's the seed that falls in the rocky soil, seed with so many stones in it, and all of the temptations and the struggles and trials of this life are there, and even though the word is initially received with joy, and there's an immediate reaction to it, the plant springs up because there is no depth to the root because of all the other things going on, because of all the temptations and all the struggles of life. There is no depth to the root, and when the sun comes up, when the real suffering of life, when the trials of life come, they aren't strong enough to handle it, and they wither. And then there's the soil that falls among, or the seeds that fall among the weeds, and they too begin to grow up, but because of all the worries and concerns of life, they're very quickly choked out. And the plant may not die, but it doesn't produce a crop either. And then finally, there's the seed that falls in good soil, and that's those that receive the word gladly and are prepared for it. And the word grows up in them to produce a good crop, a good fruit for the kingdom of God. And so that's what the parable means. Jesus gives that explanation. He says these are the analogies, these are the set points. And once again, this is kind of an interesting, this is almost a meta parable because it tells you how to understand the parable in the middle of it, along with a lot of Jesus' other teaching. And what he shows, what he says, is that how a person responds to his word is largely dependent on how their heart is prepared, what's going on inside of them will determine how they respond to what he has to say. So that's the parable of the sower. Then we have the parable of the wheat and the weeds. We have a similar situation. A farmer goes out, a wealthy landowner sends out his sowers, his farmer, to scatter seeds in his crops. And they finish the job and they go away, but that night an enemy comes and takes weeds, a seed of weeds, and scatters it among the wheat and goes away. And so later, when the crop is growing up, the workers at the farm look and say, look, there's weeds growing among your wheat. Master, didn't you plant good seed? Wasn't it good seed? Wasn't it wheat you planted? And the master says, yes, but an enemy's come and done this. And then the farmers ask, well, do you want us to go and weed it? Do you want us to go and pull out the weeds now? And the master says, no, because while you're pulling out the weeds, you'll also get some of the weeds. Just let them grow up together for now, and then at the harvest time, when the harvest comes, I will send my harvesters out, and they will gather the weeds first into bundles to be burned, and then they'll gather the wheat together and bring it into my barn. And later, Jesus also explains this one and says that the message or the seeds, the wheat that has been sown are the people of God, the people of his kingdom, and the weeds are others, and the enemy is Satan. And what he means by the rest of it is that God sowed the good seed, but the enemy came and has implanted others. And when asked, do we go and weed the garden, or do we go and pull out the weeds now? He says, no, because you might pull out some of the wheat with the weeds. He says, don't judge the church, or don't judge the people of God now. Don't try to separate out who is really genuine and who is not. That judgment is up to God, and at the end of the age, when the harvest time comes, when the end of the age comes, God will send out his angels, and they will separate. So God will separate the weed from the wheat. And in the meantime, just be content with the plot growing, with the field growing, and don't try to separate out the wheat and the weeds, absolutely. Which is kind of significant for us, like at least for me with churches, because if I had a dime for every time that I heard somebody complain or say something along the lines of, well, I don't go to church because of all the hypocrites in the church, or all the people that aren't really faithful in the church. It's like, do you go to Walmart with people that are unfaithful? Does it bother you the same way there as it does church? Doesn't seem to. Doesn't seem like it the same way. But so people say, well, I'm not going to go to church because of all the hypocrites there. Like what Jesus told us in this parable, told us from the beginning that the church, the people of God, the kingdom of God, was going to be mixed between people that were genuine and people that just looked the part, people that were genuine wheat and people that were weeds, until the time of the end, until the final judgment. So we shouldn't be surprised that there are hypocrites in the church. There are people that are very much still on their way to growing into wheat, that are wheat but aren't full grown yet. And there are people that are very much just pretending because there's all kinds of social benefits to being a member of a church. You get a community out of it even if you don't really believe a lot of the stuff. And so we've been told from the get-go that this is what would happen. This is what we should expect. And so that's what Jesus told us to expect. That's what it is. And don't try to cast judgment on who too harshly on who is who between wheat and weeds, because, as he said, you're going to miss it fairly frequently. So this is all I'm going to do for kind of general parables, but then there's a couple more that I wanted to show you as a kind of transition, because we're moving towards the conflict passages where Jesus and the conflict with the religious leaders comes out very prominently. And so for that, we've got these two, the parable of the wedding banquet and the parable of the wicked tenants. In the parable of the wedding banquet, Jesus tells the story of a wealthy master or landowner or a king that has a child being married. And so they're going to throw this great big banquet. And when they throw this great big banquet, they invite all of these people to the wedding banquet. They invite all of the officials and all of the important people in the kingdom. They invite all their friends and neighbors and all these people that they want to come to the wedding banquet. And when the time comes, when the banquet is approaching, they send out their servants to go and summon everyone. Now, the detail to know about wedding banquets in the first century is that they were not like an afternoon affair. If you go to a wedding now, you're probably going to go to a 20 or 30 minute long wedding ceremony, wedding service, and then after that you're going to go have a 2 or 3 hour party where there's lots of dancing and all the things that you normally think of for a wedding reception, and then you're going to go home, and that's it. In first century Jewish context, a wedding banquet, especially for any kind of prominent family, is like several days to a week-long affair, and you're there the whole time drinking and partying, and it's a thing, right? And so because there was so much preparation and it was such a big deal, they would often kind of have an approximate date for the wedding, and then the person throwing the wedding would send out a kind of final "come on, y'all," right before the wedding banquet was to start, and to make sure that people didn't miss it or arrive early and there was nothing prepared for it. And so the master sends out the servants to go and bring the invited guests in, and then they all start making excuses for why they can't come. Oh, I've just bought a field, part of a piece of land, and I need to go and check it out. See how it's going to do. Try out the land, because that's a great thing to do. Go buy land that you've never seen before, and go check my land. And then another one says, oh, I've just bought a team of oxen that I haven't tried, and I need to go and test them out and see if they're going to pull the plow. And another says, oh, we have things going in the family emergency, you can't come. So people start making all these kinds of excuses, and when the servants come back and tell the master this, the master is angry and says, all right, go and invite everybody. Go invite the poor and the lame and the blind. Anybody you find. Go invite everybody. Even the lowest of the low in the culture. Bring them in. And so they do. They go and they start inviting them, and there's still room left. There's still room at the wedding feast. And so the master says, go back out and go out into the highways and byways. Go out into the country and just start pulling people in. Bring them in. Whoever they are, whatever they are, bring people in. And so they do, and finally the house is filled and they have a wedding banquet. And part of the purpose of this parable is to be a kind of criticism of the Jewish people, or the Jews as a whole, but specifically the Jewish leadership, because they had been given an invitation to this kingdom. They had the law and the prophets. They had been taught all this time to recognize it. And now the time has come. The Son is here. The wedding banquet is ready to begin. The kingdom of God is ready to kick off in force. And they make excuses. They reject him. They don't understand the teaching. They don't come to him as they should. And so they reject him, as the original invitees are rejecting the invitation to the wedding. And so God says, go out and bring others in. Go out and bring the Samaritans and the Gentiles and anybody else that wants to come. Go and bring in anybody anywhere that will come. And they will take the place of those that reject me at the wedding feast. And then the parable of the wicked tenants does a similar but even more pointed thing. There's a story in the Old Testament. One of the prophets, Isaiah, gives an analogy for Israel and says that they are like a vineyard that God had planted and had given them every good thing, everything they needed to succeed and thrive. God has established and made possible for them, and yet they have not produced fruit. But Jesus takes that analogy or that image and turns it into a parable and extends it and makes it more pointedly about the religious leadership. And in Jesus' version of the story, God goes and a wealthy owner, a landowner, goes and plants a vineyard. And this vineyard, he builds a secure wall around the outside. He puts a great big guard tower inside it with room for people to live inside it. And he digs a wine press and gets all that ready. And he tends the vineyard for 3 years, because it takes about 3 years for the vines to be secure enough, steady enough, and have grown out enough that you can take fruit from them without harming them. Before that, you actually kind of cut off the fruit before it can take full shape and let the vines keep growing and getting stronger. And so the landowner has done all of this. He's created basically the perfect vineyard and has grown the vines to the point that they are ready to go. And then he hires it out or releases it out to tenants. And this is a very common, even now, this is a very common form of like farm leasing. Basically, the idea is that if you have a plot of land that you want to see farmed or that you want to make some money off of, you lease it out to a farmer, and then they will either pay you a flat rate, which is relatively common now. But even now, they will either pay you the flat rate or they will agree to a percentage of the crop. And so if the percentage is, like you get 20% of the crop, then they will either bring you literally 20% of what comes off the field, or they will go and sell it for you and then bring you 20% of what they make off of the field. And so you pay the farmer pays you a percentage of what they grow off of the land that you own. And so this is the arrangement. The master, the owner has planted the vineyard and prepared it, got it all ready, sends and hires these tenants and agrees to let them work the field and live there in exchange for a portion of the crop. And then they get to sell the rest and live off the remainder. And when the time comes, after they have been there, and again, he's already prepared it and got it ready over 3 years, so this is the first year that it'll produce a crop. And when the end of that year comes, and they have produced their crop, and they've made their wine, and they've sold off part of it, whatever, he sends his servant to collect the master's share. And instead of being able to collect it, the servant is made fun of and beaten and sent away. So the master sends another servant. And a similar thing happens to him, but it's even worse. And then finally a third servant comes, is sent, and they treat him even worse and kill him. And then the master says, surely they will respect my son. And so he sends his son to go and collect his part of the produce of the field, the produce of the vineyard. And when the wicked tenants, the tenants that he's hired, see the son coming, they say to themselves, look, there's the son. If we kill him, we can take his inheritance. Now, if that sounds a little off, it's because it is, because there's no legal system in the history of humanity that has ever said, hey, if you kill a guy, you get his inheritance. Because that would just inspire people to start killing guys, right? It'd be encouraging murder left and right. This does not work. This is not a legal provision in any legal code that I'm aware of. You do not get somebody's inheritance by killing them unless they happen to be carrying it on them and you can run away and not get caught.
You can just literally murder that one.
Yeah, they've just murdered. Yeah, they're just murdering him. And so but they think, we can kill the guy and keep his inheritance. And so they do. They bring him in, they beat him, they kill him, and they throw his body out over the wall. And then Jesus looks at the crowd, he looks at the audience, including those religious leaders, and he says, what do you think the master will do to those tenants? And there's a couple of different versions of this, and so the reply when he gets back from the crowd varies a little bit from one gospel to another, but the basic idea is he's going to kill them and give the land to somebody else. He's going to bring those wretches to a wretched end and lease the property to somebody else. And Jesus basically says, yeah, and that's what's going to happen with Israel. Because the religious leaders are the wicked tenants who have beaten and killed the prophets that God has sent before, and now God has sent his son, and they still won't listen to him and do what he says, or give God glory. And they're going to kill him and throw him out. And what is God going to do? He's going to kill them, destroy them, and give their position, their place to somebody else. And this is seen, like the religious leaders who were there very much get what he's saying, and they immediately go out and start plotting to kill him. And this is seen as Jesus predicting or foretelling what was going to happen in AD 70 when the Romans would come in and destroy the temple and break the temple down and kill off most of the priests. And the Jewish temple has never been built again after that point. Judaism is now without a temple for the last 2,000 years. And so that's the parable of the good tenants. And these two start to show the religious conflict that is growing. And we're going to pick up on that theme a lot next time. Yeah, we got like 2 minutes left, and I'm probably not going to get very far with Transfiguration. So, enjoy your week. We'll see you on Thursday.